Welcome to the 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act virtual pilgrimage. This week we are on, we're at week 8, which is really number 6 of the 21 Things. And number 6 in the 21 Things is renamed individuals with European surnames. So I'm the Reverend John Borthwick, and I serve the community here at St. Andrews in Guelph, and we're on this virtual pilgrimage through Bob Joseph's book, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act, as a recognition, as a way forward in our commitment to learn deeply the experience of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and this book is so accessible to connect us to something that was established so many years ago, the Indian Act, and yet has dramatic impacts on Indigenous peoples to this day. And so number 6 is renamed individuals with European names. This is an interesting story, an interesting reality that connects to me in a few ways from a congregation I served previously. In another congregation, what I noticed were people's names were different, and yet they were of the same family. They might have been brothers, or they might have been relations in some way. That's how they would present themselves to me, and also their own names. We would have a directory, and within the directory the name would be spelt differently. And acknowledging my privilege and my whiteness, I would say things like, well, how do you spell your name? And they might say, whatever, it's all good. And I'd be like, no, your name, like, how do you spell it? Like, how would you spell your name? And they would say, whatever one's fine. Or I would ask a question out of curiosity, how come your brother's name is spelt differently than your name? Like, your last names are different. And they would say, that's just that's the way it happened when we came to Canada. And so this would confuse me because, again, acknowledging my privilege and taking in my the lens with which I've been raised and seen the world, a name is so very important. If someone spelt my name wrong, I would let them know. I would refuse to allow it just to stand as, that's fine. I would make a big issue of like how, that's not how my name is spelled, or that's not who I am, right? Because names identify us. And what's fascinating in that story is how when people would immigrate to Canada from different countries and different nations, the people registering those names would make their own determinations on what their name was. They would just write down a certain way of spelling the name. They wouldn't care if it wasn't the right name. They would say that's too hard, and they would write it differently. They might even change people's first names. And these were folks who maybe had names that were connected in some way to the ear of the folks who were taking the register. If your name was George or John or other kinds of names that might be recognizable to someone living in Canada at a registry office for the government, these would be names that they might understand somewhat, but they would decide to change them or write them differently. Or last names that they would spell phonetically, or would try to spell them, or just, remove parts of the name. And people have lived with that as a part of their immigration experience to this country, whereby a brother has a different name spelling based on who was writing down the name that day. And for some of us, that would seem phenomenal that would happen, but that's what happened. And now when we read about number 6 under the Indian Act, Indian agents would literally rename Indigenous peoples based on they didn't want to have to deal with traditional names, ancestral names, Indigenous names. They just didn't want to deal with that. So they would literally give people, and in a challenging way for someone who represents the Christian church, they would impose a Christian name on people. And I loved Bob Joseph, the author of the books, little story where people would say, are you related to other Josephs in that community that you come from? And he would say, probably in some way, but more than likely we just had the same Indian agent who took our name and wrote our name down in the register. So much of the theme of this virtual pilgrimage is about how colonizers, the government, white people, essentially took an indigenous identity that had existed for centuries, thousands of years, millennia maybe, since the dawn of creation, as Bob puts it, and would just eliminate that within the stroke of a pen, or would impose that with, again, the writing down of a name, the telling person where they must live now, the decision as to whether, we will decide who you are and if you identify in the scope of what the Indian Act says. All of this needs to be something that we take in, that we learn about, that we understand a little better, for the sake of understanding how we can engage in conversations about justice, about truth, about reconciliation with the Indigenous community, and also around how we understand this government act within the country of Canada that continues to discriminate, oppress, and impact the daily lives of Indigenous peoples. Thank you for joining me on this virtual pilgrimage, and I'll see you again next time.